Welcome to the ThinkData Podcast in partnership with DataWorks. And on today's show, I'm really excited to welcome Jess 𝐼 to the show. Jess has over 12 years experience working within the data analytics space and is currently the data architecture manager at Underdog Fantasy. And they are one of the fastest growing sports gaming companies in the world.
Thanks for having me. So I kind of wear a lot of hats at Underdog. I'm currently leading the data engineering team, but I'm also working in this data operations function, which is kind of a new team that we're developing to be the product and project management arm of the data team. So it's really a lot of leveraging relationships across the company to understand what's coming up next, managing the roadmaps, making sure kind of like managing white space problems, like that don't have clearly defined boundaries, but problems that need to be solved. Maybe we don't know the right way to approach it. So wearing lots of hats right now, but officially managing the data engineering team.
Awesome. And as I alluded to, obviously you've been in 12 years in this space. You didn't originally start in data though, did you? Obviously, so was it more your transition was reporting analyst, and over the kind of subsequent 10, 12 years found yourself obviously going on that journey to kind of currently into a leadership role. How did that come about?
Yeah, I actually, in a previous life, I worked in HR. And then in a previous life before that, I was a revenue accountant for an oil and gas company. But when I started working in data, I wanted to make the transition because I was always attracted to projects where, we had to do a lot of analysis. And back then it was just Excel. I didn't know anything about databases, but I really loved cleaning the data and making sure that the values were right and making sure it had data integrity. And so becoming a reporting analyst, it was a great opportunity and seemed like a natural transition into more of what I enjoyed doing. And it turned out to kind of be the thing that clicked with me, something that I just happened to be pretty good at and was really interested in and curious about. So I scaled up, my skills quickly. So I, moved into starting out in reporting, kind of moving more upstream in the pipeline, moved on to architecture, building a really robust reporting layer. And then I think something I just always observed problems with how things were done on teams. I would see teams and companies make decisions around data that I didn't agree with. And, I've always been pretty vocal about those things, not in a confrontational way, but I like to solve problems. So when I see a problem, I like to voice that and try to get a solution, not only for myself, but kind of to support the people that I'm working with. And so I think because of that, it just made sense that I transitioned into leadership. And thankfully I was able to do so. I really love, being supportive of people and providing an environment where the best solutions, the best decisions can come to the surface.
No, I like that. And obviously for the listeners, I think what this episode's going to be mainly focused on, which is obviously we've spoken a lot about in the past, is that we're at an inflection point, I think, within data. I think the last couple of years has really kind of created a kind of a base point again, where organizations now need to look at what does the data function need to look like moving forward? How, what does leadership need to be doing to kind of bring through the next cohort of future leaders? And I know it's something you're hugely passionate about, which I'm excited to dig into. You touched on something really interesting there. You had a really good intuition and natural ability to identify bottlenecks and identify the way things should be done. Did you ever see yourself as a leader? Was that always the path for you, or did you, like many people, just found themselves in a leadership role because they were pretty good at spotting those gaps?
Yeah, I always wanted to be in leadership, and I think the reason for that is because I often thought to myself, if I was in charge, I would be doing it this way. I would get upset about oftentimes the things I was getting upset about were not being included in decisions that impacted my job a lot, not being given information. For example, if a data team is going to be expected to build an integration for a new third-party tool that the business is going to be bringing on, but they aren't informed of that in advance. And suddenly, you have other priorities that you're working on as a data team. And suddenly you've got this, top priority bomb that gets dropped in your lap. That it feels disrespectful, honestly.
Mm.
It would make
Yeah.
me mad. It would make me feel like, that like data is just an afterthought. Companies want data. They want to use data. They want to be able to make decisions based on data. I mean, it's just, you're constantly hearing about data and how important it is to an organization. But it seems like the people who are actually making that happen aren't always included in the conversations.
Mm.
And so they don't get the chance to call out caveats and like, hey, here's something you need to be thinking about if you want to do this. And it leads to a lot of wasted work and wasted effort. And so, yes, I always wanted to be in leadership because I wanted to model what it could look like when you do bring people into the conversation, when you do communicate openly and kind of, I call it, say the things,
Yeah.
being transparent and just communicating, honestly.
Yeah, and it says there's a lot to be said, isn't it? And you touched on something really interesting there, where data is, for so many companies, is the driving force behind a lot of their decisions, but it is so often the afterthought in terms of that data function. And actually the classic question is measuring ROI, and I think that's nothing truer than now, because with leaner data teams, automation, AI, it really is an interesting point. So in terms of leadership, then what do you think ultimately makes a great data leader? Because obviously you've been on that journey yourself. There's a lot of things coming through, like the voice of the team, having the ear of the stakeholders. But in your opinion, what do you think makes a great leader?
In general, what makes a great data leader is the same that makes a great leader in general. Just empathy, humility, leaning into curiosity. I think with data specifically, it is absolutely critical to be able to build trust and relationships with people across the company, because there's another component here too, which is you need to be comfortable with conversations that can get uncomfortable. You need to be able to push back against things. You need to be able to partner with stakeholders and not just be order takers. It's not a restaurant. So you can't just like take an order and deliver a result. Like data, it's not sustainable. You're going to burn your team out doing that kind of thing. So to protect the interests of the team, you have to be brave enough to do that. And sometimes you're having those conversations with, people in the C-suite, people at the highest levels of the company. And that can be hard. But when you have the ability to build trust and relationships, when people know you and they know where you're coming from and they know that you really do have the best interests of the company at heart and you really do want to partner with them to solve the problem, you're not just trying to be an obstructionist, the conversation becomes a lot easier, right? So for example, like, hey, Bill, I know you're the CFO and you're asking me for this dashboard. Based on what you've asked for, it's hard for me to understand what you're going to get out of this. Can you tell me what you're going to do with what's the action you're going to take after I deliver this to you? What's the problem you're really trying to solve? You have to have trust to be able to have that conversation, but then the conversation itself actually further enhances the trust, because Bill, your CFO, is then going to know, Jess is always going to tell me if this isn't going to give me what I want. Jess is going to be transparent with me when there might be a better solution, and she's always going to work to find the thing that's actually going to help me solve the problem. It's also going to build trust with your team because they're going to see you protecting them. They're going to see you, advocating for real solutions and not just busy work. Teams get burned out all the time because a lot of leaders in data, they say yes to everything without questioning, is this really a priority? Is it a priority right now? Is this really a data solution? Some things that data teams get asked for really should be an engineering solution, maybe a custom tool that gets built or something like that. So I think it really just comes down to trust and relationships, honestly. And that's aside for, obviously, like if you're a data leader, you need to have the technical expertise. You need to understand the technical aspects of the whole data pipeline. But, aside from that, trust.
Yeah, I think it's super important. I think you kind of mentioned something there which I want to kind of dig on. I think it's a lot of what you're referencing there is the stakeholder piece, the ability to influence, the ability to build credibility both up and down the organization. Managing up is just as important as managing down. So it begs the question, why do so many organizations focus on bringing in external talent that don't know the business, don't know the teams, haven't built those relationships to make those decisions, as opposed to investing their time, efforts, and money into developing their future leaders?
Yeah, this is such a great question. So this is just my observation. Obviously, I'm not in every company, but from what I've seen, it's pretty rare to have people in the highest levels of leadership who have ever worked with data, been data
Mm,
professionals, understand the nuances and the challenges of producing really great data products. I think from the outside looking in, if you've never done the job, it seems really easy. We have data from all these sources. We have a database. What's the problem? Give me what I want.
simple as that.
There- Right, exactly. And I'm sure like any data professional listening right now, it's like, yes, like, you can totally identify with this. I mean, every company I've worked at, it just seems like that's the perception. So when senior leaders have that perception, it's almost like they think, well, if there was anyone on the team who was capable of solving this problem, then it would already be solved. It wouldn't be a problem. Obviously, we don't have anyone on the team who can lead the team out of this. So we need to go find this external talent. Really, I would honestly advise, before bringing in external talent, just have conversations with your team. You might discover facets to the problem that you weren't aware of before. You might piece together patterns and information. Honestly, a lot of these problems that data teams have could truly be solved with conversations.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
yeah, I mean, you just have to be curious and really understand the problem before you try to solve it. And that's like a running theme, through, I think it just keeps going through my head with different situations that happen and different situations that I hear about. It's
Mm,
just, I think you hear a lot when you're looking for leaders. A lot of job descriptions will say bias for action. We're looking for a bias for action. I know companies want to move quick. In my opinion, a bias for action doesn't mean, oh, I have all the answers immediately and I'm going to make this decision right now. I'm acting.
yeah.
To me, a bias for action is, okay, I see a problem and I'm taking steps to solve it. And one of those steps is gathering information and having conversations and defining what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So it's just this lack of communication and maybe this unconscious bias that maybe you can't trust what people on the data team say because they aren't leaders yet. Maybe you think, well, they don't get it, they've never been a director, they're not going to know. And I just don't think that's true at all.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because from my experience in the space, obviously benefiting from hiring people into organizations, the amount of trouble that is sometimes brought with bringing someone external, and that's why the tenure for managers is so low, because people will come into an organization, realize either what they've been told isn't exactly what is there, or the people that who have been there for a while have kind of made a kind of put their hand up and gone, hang on a minute, this isn't how we've always done it. And I think you touched something interesting, where they've got to come in and make an impact, and actually there's got to be action, but actually most of this is a reaction. They come in, they've got to make change, they've got to, and actually the change doesn't need to be immediate. Having these conversations and over the course of the next 3, 6, 12 months could ultimately lead you to a more stable and a happy team. And I know Underdog are a remote company. I know that a lot of organizations are remote. How big an impact do you think the remote culture has had to leadership. And what I mean by that is back in the day, years ago, obviously you had the water cooler chats, you had those kind of whiteboards, you're in the moment, you were talking about things, but now you're having to set meetings, you're having to kind of go into these, there's nothing really off the cuff anymore. How do you feel that kind of remote culture has kind of impacted this kind of leadership layer?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question because we are seeing remote culture kind of growing and there's more of a
Mm,
demand for remote jobs. I personally love working remotely, and I I think that an effective leader can still create a culture of connection and create those opportunities for water cooler chats while still, meeting the objectives of the business.
yeah,
You have to be really intentional about it. You have to be, you have to be really judicious about which meetings you take and what the team rituals are. You have to be really careful about not wasting people's time. But I think I just think that an effective leader is going to be they're going to be effective whether it's remote or in person. And when you care about building connection, that really comes through in your interactions with people.
yeah,
It's about, okay, so you're remote, you're not seeing people every day necessarily, but every time you start a meeting with them, you're asking, how are you doing? Like,
yeah,
honestly, like, and I'll often check in with people and be like, how are you doing? And of course, everyone's like, oh, I'm doing good. But then I'll be like, okay, but how are you really doing? What's new in your world right now? A lot of times what's new in your world right now is really a great way to open the door to, sometimes they'll tell you, oh, we just moved into this new house and we're
yeah,
we're painting and remodeling. Or they'll tell you, God, I'm having like such a rough day. My dog, I just found out my dog has cancer. It's really hard. You can show up for people in really little moments that don't take much time at all. You're getting to know people, you're building that connection, and you don't have to be in an office to do that.
yeah. I think it's important, isn't it? It's those kind of non-work chats, but you can go in with a conversation with always a work agenda, but actually having 5 or so minutes just to talk about anything other than work is actually can be quite liberating. And I know you've worked in large organizations. You obviously, I've been working in a faster growing startup environment. What do you think the differences are between the type of leadership that comes into a smaller business, such as a startup, versus those kind of more established players out there? Do you think that ultimately there's a different type of manager that is needed for that environment, or do you think if you're a good manager, you should be able to work in both?
Mm. Um, Gosh, I, I think, okay, I have two answers to this question. I do think that someone who is naturally a good leader, and I mean, I say naturally, by naturally a good leader, I mean someone who is constantly self-reflecting and improving themselves and,
Yeah,
curious. And when you have those qualities, you're going to be an effective leader, usually. Someone who is like that can be effective in both settings. Not everyone is effective in both settings, and not
mm,
everyone, they definitely are different types of problems that need to be solved. When you're a, at a startup, you're building everything from scratch. So, decisions need to be made that are going to, I mean, all decisions impact the future, but you're kind of making foundational decisions. Like, this is how we're going to start things. This is how we're
like a
going to do things.
direct impact almost. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're really laying the foundation for what's going to become the data culture at that organization. You're going
Mm,
to be scaling up the team. A lot of times you're going to be doing so rapidly. So lots of interviewing, lots of, okay, headcount plans, and here's what we need and here's what we want to do. At a larger company, obviously headcount interviewing, that's part of it too, but a lot of the culture is kind of already established. And so it seems like at a larger company, you're usually, if you're coming into leadership at a larger company, it's because they have a problem that needs to be solved that the previous leader didn't solve. So it's often
yeah.
pretty clear, okay, here's what I've been brought in to do. I think it's just it just feels different, the problems are just different. And it also, the pace of things matters a lot, because in a startup, I mean, it moves really, really quickly. It can move so
Mm,
quickly, it can make your head spin, and it can feel like chaos. And not all leaders thrive in that environment. At an established company, things can move quickly sometimes, but a lot of times it's like status quo, and you have more space to think through a problem. I mean, things take longer because there tends to be more layers of management, more bureaucracy, more process. Processes are often a little bit more well defined.
mm.
So, I think an effective leader can be successful in both, but it really depends on how comfortable you are with ambiguity, how fast you're willing to pace your work, and, just kind of what your strengths are.
Yeah, if for many the lure of a startup, their expectation versus reality doesn't always marry up, doesn't it? And whilst on one hand, yeah, it sounds great, I want a fast-paced startup, and they join that fast-paced startup, and they're like, no, I want to go back to my footsie and be comfortable with my team of 50. So
Yeah, not
I'm
like this.
no, I didn't mean this. I meant something
Yeah.
else. And I'm interested to touch on something we spoke about right at the beginning, where organizations find it not easier, but their default tends to be, we need a leader or a manager, we're going to bring him in. And equally, that manager's come from somewhere else, so they've lost their manager over there. And there was, aside from the last kind of 12 or so months, been quite a transient nature between this data leadership layer, where they're moved to the next project, the next kind of opportunity, but tenure is still pretty low. I think one of the last reports was between 16 and 20 months was the average kind of tenure of a data leader or data manager. What steps should companies be taking really then to retain these managers? Because do you think it really ties into the growth appetite of the business? In other words, if the company's not growing headcount, then the manager may feel, well, this is stagnant. Or do you think there's any other kind of factors at play here?
I personally think it all comes down to culture.
Yeah.
I think that, so first of all, something that executive leadership needs to understand is that data professionals, I mean, at all levels, managers, individual contributors, whatever, those skill sets are transferable to lots of different fields.
Mm,
And data, a good data professional is really not often going to have a hard time finding work. That's been my experience.
yeah.
I know there's been a lot of layoffs. Like right now, the market is kind of, flooded with people who are looking for work. But what I've seen is really good data professionals who kind of have leveraged relationships across the industry are always going to have opportunities. That means if what you're offering is not working for them, they can
Mm,
they can go somewhere else. So again, it comes down to culture. If you want people to want to stay at your company and solve problems, you need to provide the culture and the psychological safe spaces to do that. People need to
yeah.
feel free speaking up. Feedback needs to flow freely up and down the organization without penalty. I should be able to tell my manager, hey, it's really getting in the way of me being able to work effectively when you X, Y, or Z, right?
Yeah.
I should be able to tell my direct report, hey, the way you did this project, it's really not up to par. It's not
Yeah.
the level of quality I would expect for this type of project. I'm going to need you to redo it. It's not personal. Like feedback should be based on a thing that happened, right? You're addressing
Yeah.
behaviors, addressing things that can be more effective. And the more freely that flows through an organization, the more trust is going to be built. If I know my manager is going to tell me when I'm messing up or when I'm getting in my own way, that's going to make me trust them more. If I know my team is going to tell me, hey, Jess, like, here's something you could be doing to support me better, that's going to
Yeah.
build trust with my team. I think it's also important for managers to ask regularly, what's something I could be doing to support you better? How
Yeah.
can I make sure that you have what you need to do your job? So building that culture of feedback, trust, transparency is huge. When you make a decision, share the rationale. I hear a lot of leaders talking about, well, don't share this information yet. We don't want to cause confusion. We don't want to cause panic. Like, these are adults. They're capable of understanding nuance. Unless there's things that have to be kept confidential, obviously, for various reasons. But if something doesn't need to be kept confidential, there's no reason not to share that information. And people feel more valued when you do. When you hide information unnecessarily, it makes people feel like you're treating them like children. It feels disrespectful, and it feels like, I don't know, like, what, you just think I'm expendable? You just think that I like don't need to know? And it'll be, I'll see people announcing organizational changes to reporting structure in large groups. People are finding out they're going to have a new boss and their whole job's going to change in large groups of people. I mean, there's just no reason for that. It's really about treating people like human beings, building trust and relationships, and providing opportunities to continue developing as a leader. And those opportunities could be formal training. They can be, maybe providing a budget for people to buy books about leadership or whatever. And they can happen organically. So at Underdog, I started a group called Level Up, and it's just basically we read books together, kind of like Dare to Lead, Atomic Habits, Thanks for the Feedback, books that help us develop. I'm on a personal journey to be the best leader I can be, not only at work, but in my life. Like, I want to be the best version of myself possible. And so I would be doing these things anyway. So Level Up was a way for me to invite other people into that process and share that with them. And it's been great because it's had the unexpected outcome of I'm getting to build relationships and connections with people across the company that I wouldn't normally get to work with on a day-to-day basis. So when you allow employees to kind of self-create groups and, take charge for opportunities to develop their own leadership potential, helping to connect them to the leaders inside themselves, I think is really key.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think it's, for people listening here, I think it's really ties into the leadership layer, getting to know their team, because you touched on something earlier about oh, don't tell them this, we don't want this to kind of spread. But if they ultimately knew the person they're managing, then they would have a better gauge on how they'd react, instead of assuming, they might not like this. Well, actually, if you knew, you could probably have a pretty frank conversation with them and they'd be ultimately totally fine with it, or they'd push back and ask that conversation to be kind of explained some more. So look, there's something really, there's obviously a shift happening at the moment, 12, 18 months. There's layoffs. It's for people out there, it seems relatively doom and gloom, and a lot of people listening to this are on that job hunt, which is challenging, and it's a tricky time. But there's also been a lot of talk about how the role of a data manager is ultimately changing, because there's a lot of talk where they need to be more hands-on, or they need to be more senior and owning the strategy. I know you've not got the crystal ball, but as someone who's doing it and have seen this and have networks in far places, how do you see the role of this manager layer changing over the coming months and years?
Yeah, I see. You have to be a unicorn. You have to be like magical and be able to zoom into the weeds and zoom out to the organizational strategy and know everyone in the company. I mean, I think data is probably the most, from a business perspective, intersectional places in the company, because everyone's coming to you with needs, and everything that is being asked for is high priority to the people that are asking for it.
Of course.
So, I think we're going to see data teams being asked to do more with less.
Yep.
Which means there are going to be fewer leaders, which means the leaders that are there are going to have to be responsible for a larger chunk of the pipeline. So you're going to need to know more technically to be able to give guidance and help facilitate those conversations to bring those solutions to light. There's also this really, really important emphasis, which rightly so, honestly, on data governance.
Yeah.
You hear all the time about data breaches and security incidents and all kinds of things where data is not being managed properly. And it can even be things like you're exposing personal information to employees who shouldn't be able to see it about your customers, right?
Yeah.
So data governance is really, really important. I think that what we're really going to need is leaders who can help teams build that solid enterprise data platform that can facilitate self-service so that you're doing less ad hoc stuff for your stakeholders. You empower them to answer their own questions, and also bakes in that really robust data governance framework. You have to have the data governance framework. And I think we're going to see a lot of companies want leaders who know how to do that and know how to get buy-in and not only build it, but like sustain and support it, train employees on the importance of data governance and good data stewardship and, all of that. So we're, and like finally, my final point is that managers are going to have to act more like product managers.
Yeah, interesting. We've definitely seen that shift.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm already kind of doing that, and I think that's going to be a hat leaders are going to have to wear more.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I think with obviously trends, obviously I put AI in that at the moment. There's the transition happening, and obviously, that it sounds like the key kind of focus is adaptability. People are kind of getting ahead of things, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of people listen here who have aspirations to be a manager. But they may be in an organization where they're not sure what the next step is. If you had one bit of advice for them, what would it be?
Well, I have a couple of bits of advice. I would say first, stay technically sharp. Obviously, always got to stay technically sharp. The industry is just changing so fast. There's so many new technologies and tools all the time. So stay on top of that. I think this is going to sound weird, but go to therapy, work through your traumas, work on yourself, get to know yourself so that you can show up in the way that you need to be a sturdy leader for people. When you can do that, when you know yourself, you can tell when you're in a conversation, oh, I'm feeling defensive. I need to, check my tone. I need to like open my mind. Like we're just having a conversation here. That's going to help you build connection and trust more quickly. Also reading books like Good to Great, Built to Last books. Jim Collins has done a tremendous amount of amazing research on what it takes to build and sustain a great enduring company. And you can take the principles from those books and apply them to how you're running your team, how you're running your life. There's a lot of really great wisdom in there. Even if you're not an entrepreneur and you're not starting your own company, just, okay, here's what it would take. Here's how we need to be thinking about things. It's all about discipline and rigor. So I think all of those things, but mostly developing yourself, continuing to grow and learn, and having a growth mindset.
Love that. I really enjoyed it. It's been a conversation I've been really looking forward to. I think you've offered a lot of people some fascinating insight, and I think on the face of it, it's the the ultimate role, and you want to get into leadership, but there's a lot to consider, isn't there? It's not just like, this is the pinnacle of where you're going to get to. They need to, on your point there, just be ready. Have they worked on themselves? Are they going to be a great brand ambassador? Are they going to be the ear of the team? Are they going to really go into battle for you? So I think it's some really good points, Justin. Thanks so much. It's been my absolute pleasure to have you on this morning, and I'm sure this will be a hugely popular episode.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really passionate about talking. I could talk about this all day, so it's been a pleasure.
Lovely. Thanks, Jess. And obviously have a great 4th of July. I appreciate it.
Thanks, you too.
Take care.